Hey everybody, Brian Marvel here. Hope that you're doing well and welcome back. This is our third installment in asking the question, what is the Bible all about? And in our first two videos, we said that the Bible is best understood as a story, as a narrative, and we looked at two big picture views of understanding the storyline of the Bible. And we said that Jesus stands at the center of this story. Sometimes it's easy to read the Bible and fall into the trap that the Bible is really all about us and how God is going to make our lives better, but it's Jesus who is at the center of the story. If we think of it in literary terms, Jesus is the protagonist, or he is the hero of the story. And so we also said in our last video that one of the things that Jesus does in his ministry is he fulfills the Israelite story of the Old Testament. And if we are going to understand how Jesus does that, we first have to understand the Israelite story. And so in this video, I want to give you 5 moments in their story that help give some handles on what their story is all about, and then show how Jesus fulfills their story and what that means for us. And so we're going to pick up the Israelite story at the end of Genesis. In Genesis 46, we find that the Israelites are moving to Egypt. They live in Canaan, but they are moving to Egypt. And the reason they're moving to Egypt is because they have heard that there is food in Egypt. There is famine in their land, but there's food in Egypt. And this symbol is just an Egyptian symbol that represents life, to represent that this is where the Israelites were going. They were going for safety so they could survive because there was food there. Now, when the Israelites went to Egypt, they weren't a nation yet. They were a large extended family of about 70 people. But once they got to Egypt, they lived there for hundreds of years, and they grew and they grew and they grew to be a large nation of a few 100,000, if not even a few million people. And so there's a new Pharaoh. Once we get into the book of Exodus, we finish up Genesis, and we get into Exodus, there's a new Pharaoh on the scene who is threatened by the size of the Israelites. And so what he does in response is he oppresses them, he enslaves them, and he uses them to build his empire so he can remain rich, strong, and powerful. And after a few hundred years, the Israelites are fed up. They're fed up with their suffering, and they start to cry out to God, "Where are you? Have you forgotten about us? What has happened to us? How are we going to make it through?" And so God, in response, sends a man by the name of Moses to redeem the people. And he goes toe to toe with Pharaoh. He confronts Pharaoh and says, "You have to let my people go." And after this bitter battle, lasting who knows how long, Pharaoh finally gets to the point where he says, "Fine, let them go." And the first thing that happens when the Israelites leave Egypt is they come to the Red Sea. They have to cross this massive body of water. It's too big for them to go around or forge across. They're pinned up against the river. They're not sure what to do. And God miraculously, through Moses, parts the waters of the Red Sea so that they can walk across on dry land and now be free and in the clear. And God wants to take them to this place called the Promised Land. But to get to the Promised Land, this beautiful place that God has prepared for them, they first have to go through the wilderness. They have to go through the desert. And this is just a picture of a cactus kind of representing the wilderness. I'm sure there's not cacti over there, but for the sake of a symbol, here it is. And they spend 40 years in the wilderness. The reason why they spend so much time in the wilderness is in part because they disobey. They wander from God, they drift away, they grumble and complain, and they ultimately say, "It would be better for us to be back in Egypt than here wandering the wilderness." And so God leaves them out in the wilderness because of their disobedience for 40 years. Now, another thing that happens while in the wilderness is God sends their leader, Moses, this place called Mount Sinai, this mountain, and he says, "Come up the mountain to meet with me because I am going to give you the law." The law in the Old Testament, the 10 Commandments and some 600 other laws that the Israelites were supposed to obey wasn't God's way of trying to squash their joy and just give them a bunch of rules to make life difficult. But it was one of the ways that God gave the people a new identity. They had been enslaved for hundreds of years. That's all they knew. But God was saying, no, you are my treasured possession. So I'm going to distinguish you from all of the other nations. And this law is going to tell you how to live and how to care for one another and how to be a blessing to the entire world. But the Israelites spend 40 years in the wilderness because they distrust God, they drift away from Him, they disobey, and they aren't faithful to the calling that He has for them. Now, fast forward to the New Testament. In Matthew 1, Jesus comes on the scene. Jesus comes on the scene as a baby boy in Matthew 1. And right away, there's controversy surrounding his birth. King Herod, who is king of the Jews at that time, hears that there is this baby who's been born, who is someday going to be a new king of the Jews, and he is threatened by this baby, so he goes out to kill this baby. And God gives word to Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, and tells them to go to Egypt. He goes to Egypt in Matthew 2 for safety, to live there till this threat has passed. And then, at the end of Matthew 2, Jesus and his parents are called out of Egypt in the same way that the Israelites were called out of Egypt. And then we enter into Matthew 3. Jesus is now an adult, and the first place that he goes is to the Jordan River to be baptized, which could symbolize one of two things. One, it could symbolize the crossing of the Red Sea, in the same way that the Israelites crossed through the Red Sea, because right after Jesus is baptized, he goes into the wilderness in Matthew 4. Not for 40 years, but for 40 days, symbolizing their 40-year wandering. The Israelites were tempted and tested in the desert for 40 years, and they failed. Jesus goes in the desert for 40 days where he is tempted and tested by the devil, but he prevails. So the baptism in the Jordan could symbolize crossing of the Red Sea, but it could also symbolize the Israelites' entrance into the Promised Land. Because once they get back on track with God, back in Exodus, God eventually brings them into the Promised Land, and the way they enter into the Promised Land is through the Jordan River, the same river where Jesus goes to be baptized. Essentially, Jesus is stepping into something new. He's saying a new thing is happening in your history. Are you aware of it? Now, after Jesus comes out of the desert in Matthew 4, he goes up a mountain. It's not the same mountain that Moses goes up, but he goes up a mountain nonetheless to give his famous Sermon on the Mount. And what he does at the beginning of this sermon is he says, I have not come to abolish the law, I have come to fulfill the law. And then he starts to talk about the law of Moses, and he uses this formula and this pattern through his message to say, you have heard this. And then he recites one of the laws of Moses, but I tell you this, essentially reinterpreting the laws of Moses. Again, saying a new chapter in Israel's history has arrived. Something new has happened. Open your eyes. And so what you see in this movement is that Jesus, not only is he fulfilling their story, he's retracing the steps of their story to show that a new chapter in the story is beginning. And how he most fully does this is through his death. All of the Gospels end with Jesus dying on the cross. And his death happens during a major Jewish festival known as Passover. And the Passover festival was the way that the Israelites remembered this redemptive rescue from God when they were slaves in Egypt hundreds of years, if not thousands of years before. Because the final day, before Pharaoh finally let the Israelites go, God says to Moses, go tell the people to take a lamb and to sacrifice it. And take the blood of this lamb and paint it on the doorposts of your home. Because I'm going to send my angel to pass over all of Egypt. And anybody who does not have the blood of a lamb painted on the doorposts of their home, I'm going to take their firstborn son. But any home that does have the blood of a lamb painted on their doorposts, I will pass over them and I will spare them. So Jesus comes with not the lamb, the blood of a lamb painted on the doorposts of a house, but the blood of him painted on a cross. In the same way that this lamb and this Passover moment, and God taking the firstborn son of all the Egyptians as a way to kind of represent judgment on them for their cruel treatment to the Israelites, that was the thing that launched the redemptive movement, the rescue movement, the exodus of God's people from Egypt. In that same way, Jesus comes offering himself as the true Passover lamb to ignite a new redemptive movement for all of humanity. Not redemption from slavery in Egypt, but redemption and rescue from us enslaved to sin. See, Jesus comes to rescue, redeem, and restore. In the same way that God sent Moses to rescue, redeem, and restore, Jesus does the exact same thing. He retraces the steps of Israel's story to show that a new redemptive movement is happening in and through him. And it's a redemptive movement that's not just for the Israelites, but it's for the entire world. And so what this means for us is it means that we get to enter into the story. We are part of that redemptive rescue movement. Jesus wants to give us a new identity as beloved children, sons and daughters of God, who have a new identity, who have a new trajectory of their life. And so Jesus is simply retracing the steps of the Old Testament to show that a new redemption has started, and it's bound up in him, and it's extended to you and me. So I hope this quick flyby of the Old Testament and Israel's story helps you understand what Jesus is doing. And that as you see Jesus' ministry in this way, it continues to drive you back to the scriptures, to explore more, to ask new questions, to try and figure out what this big book is all about, so that you can deeply understand who you are called to be. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope that it continues to inspire you to study the scriptures, not just to increase your knowledge, but ultimately to connect with God. And I invite you back next time as we're going to look at another way to understand what the Bible is all about, kind of through a new lens of God redeeming his people and rescuing them and restoring them back to his presence. Come back, see us again soon, and have a great rest of your day. Take care. Grace and peace to you.